In July of 2002, the summer heat had settled gently over eastern Pennsylvania. It was the kind of season where days felt longer than usual, where people lingered outside, and where the idea of leaving town for a few days didn't feel reckless or dramatic. For Joe Wills and Maribel Knox, the decision to take a short road trip wasn't about escape. It was about space, about clearing their heads before life pulled them in different directions. Joe was 22, steady, predictable in the way people relied on without thinking about it. He worked regular hours, showed up when he said he would, and answered his phone even when he was tired. Maribel, 21, was careful by nature. She planned ahead, double-checked details, and didn't take risks for the thrill of it. They had known each other for years, long enough that their friendship felt uncomplicated. No drama, no secrets, just familiarity. Their plan was simple. They would leave Friday afternoon, drive west, maybe stop wherever felt right, and be back by Sunday night. There was no hotel reservation, no strict itinerary, just gas money, snacks, and the freedom of an open road. They told their families when they'd be home. Joe mentioned it casually, the way people do when they don't expect anything to go wrong. Maribel texted her mother with a rough timeline and a promise to call Sunday evening. They left in Joe's blue sedan, a car that blended in easily, clean but unremarkable. It was reliable, serviced regularly, nothing that would draw attention. As they pulled away, there was no sense of finality, no moment anyone would later remember as strange. Just two friends heading out, certain they'd be back in a couple of days. Friday passed without issue. Saturday came and went quietly. No one expected constant updates. In 2002, cell service was spotty outside major towns, and no one found that unusual. It wasn't until Sunday evening that the absence began to register. Maribel's mother called her phone shortly after dinner. It rang, then went to voicemail. She tried again an hour later. Same result. Joe's family assumed he was still driving, maybe running late. They waited. As night settled in, the silence felt heavier than it should have. By Monday morning, the unease grew sharper. Joe didn't show up for work. He hadn't called. His phone went straight to voicemail every time. Maribel missed a shift she had specifically said she wouldn't. Friends started reaching out to each other, asking the same quiet question. Have you heard from them? By Monday afternoon, concern turned into something more defined, something colder. Families retraced conversations, searching for details they might have overlooked. But there was nothing. No arguments, no last-minute changes, no mention of meeting anyone else. Tuesday morning, both families made the same decision independently. They went to the police. The initial response was measured, procedural. Officers listened, took notes, asked the standard questions. How long had they known each other? Were they romantically involved? Did either have financial trouble? Problems at home? The answers were consistent. Joe and Maribel were stable. They had plans. They had reasons to come back. Still, early assumptions leaned toward delay rather than danger. A missed turn, a broken phone, a choice to extend the trip without telling anyone. It happened often enough to warrant patience. Officers advised waiting, suggested they might turn up within a day or two. But as hours stretched on, the absence became harder to explain. Phone records showed no recent activity, no texts sent, no calls made after Saturday night. Credit cards hadn't been used, bank accounts untouched. It was as if they had stepped out of their lives all at once. Friends spoke to investigators, repeating the same descriptions. Joe didn't disappear. Maribel didn't take risks. Neither had ever gone off the grid. They weren't running from anything. They weren't chasing something reckless. The blue sedan became the focus. Its license plate was entered into national databases. Patrol units were alerted. Nearby states were notified. Yet the car didn't surface. No traffic camera captured it. No toll booth recorded it passing through. No gas station attendant remembered seeing them. Search efforts began cautiously. Officers drove known routes, checked rest areas, scanned ditches and pull-offs. There were no skid marks, no abandoned belongings, no reports of accidents matching their vehicle. As days passed, the tone shifted subtly. The calm assumption of delay gave way to a more fragile hope. Families began calling daily, then multiple times a day. Each ring of the phone brought a brief spike of anticipation, followed by disappointment. The absence of evidence was what unsettled investigators most. Even accidents left traces: a broken guardrail, a call for help, a witness. But Joe and Maribel had left nothing behind. No trail to follow. No indication of panic or distress. By the end of the week, the case was officially classified as a missing persons investigation. Flyers were printed, photos circulated. Faces that had once belonged to ordinary routines now stared out from bulletin boards and newspapers. And still, there was nothing. The quiet surrounding their disappearance became its own presence. It pressed in slowly, suffocating optimism without making noise. Friends began to speak in lower voices. Family slept less. Every possible explanation was considered, then dismissed. Voluntary disappearance didn't fit. There was no preparation, no withdrawals, no packed bags left behind. Foul play had no anchor point, no struggle, no contact, no witnesses. An accident seemed possible, but without debris or location, it remained only an idea. Each night ended the same way, with unanswered phones, with the same empty spaces at dinner tables, with the growing realization that something had gone wrong long before anyone noticed. By the second week, search efforts expanded, but directionless. Roads blended into one another. Forests stretched on without markers. Waterways posed impossible questions. Where do you look when you don't know where someone was headed? For Joe and Maribel's families, time slowed unnaturally. Every hour felt borrowed. Every morning began with the same thought. Maybe today. But as July moved forward, that thought grew quieter, less hopeful, replaced by a new fear. That whatever had happened on that road, whatever choice or mistake or moment of bad luck had altered their path, had already passed beyond reach. And somewhere out there, unseen and unrecorded, the journey that was supposed to end by Sunday had stopped, without explanation, without witnesses, and without leaving behind a single clear answer. The first days after Joe Wills and Maribel Knox were reported missing moved with an uneasy kind of restraint. Pennsylvania State. Police followed procedure, careful not to rush to conclusions that evidence couldn't yet support. There was still an assumption, spoken quietly but felt everywhere, that something ordinary might explain their absence. A wrong turn, a delay, a stretch of road where phones stopped working. Phone records were requested early. Analysts traced the last confirmed activity to late Saturday night, a single tower ping that placed their phones somewhere along a rural corridor west of where they'd started. It wasn't precise enough to narrow down a location, only enough to confirm one unsettling fact. After that moment, there was nothing. No outgoing calls, no texts, no voicemail checks, just silence. Financial records told the same story. Credit cards hadn't been used. Debit cards showed no withdrawals. Bank accounts were untouched. Whatever had happened, it happened quickly enough to stop all routine behavior at once. That detail alone began to unsettle investigators. People who choose to disappear usually leave traces of preparation. Joe and Maribel had left none. Traffic data offered no help. Toll booths recorded thousands of vehicles every day, but none matched Joe's blue sedan. Highway cameras showed nothing conclusive. The car seemed to vanish between stretches of road that should have left some kind of record. Formal searches began within days. Troopers drove the routes most likely taken, focusing on highways first, then branching off onto secondary roads. They checked rest stops, scenic overlooks, and gas stations. Patrols scanned ditches and embankments for broken brush or disturbed gravel. Nothing stood out. No debris. No oil stains. No skid marks. As the search widened, it became less structured and more desperate. Teams were sent to riverbanks, where roads curved close to the water. Crews walked wooded pull-offs, where drivers sometimes stopped to rest. Abandoned properties were checked, places where a car could have gone unnoticed. Each location raised the same question. If they'd been here, where was the evidence? Search dogs were brought in, trained to detect scent even after days had passed. Near a rural access road branching off from a main route, one dog briefly picked up a trail. Handlers slowed, focused, but the scent weakened quickly, breaking apart as if carried away by wind or water. Within minutes, it was gone entirely. That moment lingered with investigators longer than they admitted. It suggested proximity without clarity. Close enough to feel something, too far to follow it. Every possible explanation was placed on the table. An accident seemed plausible, but accidents left marks. A guardrail bent, a witness calling it in, a car partially visible. Voluntary disappearance was discussed, then quietly set aside. Joe and Maribel had no history of impulsive behavior. No unresolved conflicts, no cash withdrawals, no packed belongings missing from their homes. Foul play remained the darkest possibility, but there was nothing to support it. No reports of altercations, no suspicious phone calls, no known enemies. It was a theory without a starting point. As days turned into weeks, the search consumed resources without producing answers. Media outlets initially covered the story, drawn to the image of two young friends who had vanished without explanation. Photos of Joe and Maribel appeared on local news segments and in newspapers. Their faces became briefly familiar to strangers. Then the updates stopped coming. Without new information, attention shifted elsewhere. Other stories replaced theirs. The public's curiosity faded, not because the case was solved, but because there was nothing new to say. Silence became the defining feature of the investigation. For the families, that silence was unbearable. They called investigators constantly, asking about new searches, new angles, new ideas. They suggested places to check, routes to revisit. They asked the same questions over and over, hoping repetition might produce a different answer. Investigators understood the pressure, but they were running out of options. Search grids grew larger and less precise. Each additional mile added diluted the effort. There was no anchor point, no last known stop to work backward from. Privately, some officers began to consider a possibility they were reluctant to voice, that the car might be underwater. Pennsylvania was dotted with rivers, creeks, ponds, quarries. Many were deep enough to hide a vehicle indefinitely. In 2002, there was no efficient way to search them all. That idea shifted the emotional tone of the case. It replaced uncertainty with something heavier. Water erased sound. Water erased movement. Water erased evidence. Still, without a specific location, it remained only a theory. As summer edged toward fall, the initial urgency drained away. Search operations were scaled back. Active patrols ended. The case moved into a holding pattern, officially unsolved, unofficially stalled. Joe and Maribel's names were added to databases. Their photos were archived. Their blue sedan was listed as missing. The expectation, unspoken but present, was that someday, somewhere, something would surface. For the families, waiting became a way of life. They replayed the last conversations, searching for hidden meaning. They wondered if a decision made in seconds had sealed their fate. They imagined roads they might have taken, turns they might have missed. Every unknown number triggered a rush of adrenaline. Every knock at the door brought a brief, terrifying hope. And every time it wasn't them, the silence settled deeper. Investigators, too, carried the case with them. It lingered in quiet moments, resurfacing when similar disappearances crossed their desks. 2 people gone, a car missing, no trail. The kind of case that stayed unfinished in the mind. By the end of that year, the search for Joe Wills and Maribel Knox had reached its first true dead end. There were no active leads, no new evidence, only theories stacked on top of one another, each unable to support its own weight. And beneath all of it, an unspoken fear grew stronger. That wherever the road had ended for them, it was a place no one had thought to look. A place that would keep its secret year after year, while life above it moved on, unaware that the answers everyone was waiting for might already be resting, unseen, just out of reach. The months that followed the initial search slipped quietly into years, and with each passing season, the disappearance of Joe Wills and Maribel Knox changed shape. It was no longer an active emergency. It became something heavier and harder to define. An absence that settled into daily life without ever resolving itself. By the time the first year passed, there were no more organized search parties, no fresh flyers taped to storefront windows. The blue sedan remained listed as missing, but it was just one entry among thousands. Joe and Maribel's case didn't close. It simply stopped moving. For their families, time moved differently. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Holidays were marked by empty chairs and conversations that circled around what couldn't be said. Joe's parents kept his room mostly untouched, convincing themselves it was practical. Maribel's mother saved every voicemail message, even the ones that meant nothing at the time. Letting go felt like a betrayal. As years passed, people around them began to move forward in visible ways. Friends married, siblings advanced in careers, had children of their own. Each milestone carried a quiet weight of guilt. Living felt wrong when 2 lives remained suspended, somewhere between past and present. Every July, small vigils were held. At first, dozens attended. Candles were lit. Stories were shared. Over time, the crowds thinned. By the 5th year, it was mostly family and a handful of close friends. The questions remained the same. The answers never changed. Investigators revisited the case periodically, usually prompted by internal reviews or changes in technology. In the late 2000s, cold case units took another look, applying updated databases and national missing persons systems. Joe and Maribel's names were re-entered. Their vehicle information was cross-checked against newly recovered cars in neighboring states. Nothing matched. Advances in mapping software allowed investigators to overlay old search grids with new terrain data. Roads that didn't exist in 2002 were added. Old ones were re-examined. Rivers were mapped more precisely. Quarries, ponds, and retention basins were noted. The list of potential hiding places grew longer instead of shorter. The idea that their car might be submerged became more accepted, though still unprovable. Water had a way of erasing mistakes. A vehicle could slip beneath the surface without noise, without witnesses, and remain hidden for decades. But Pennsylvania's landscape offered too many possibilities. Without a last known stop, there was no starting point. That uncertainty wore down even seasoned investigators. The case files were thin. There were no suspects to interrogate, no forensic evidence to retest. Every review ended the same way, with the same unanswered questions neatly returned to storage. For the families, the psychological toll was relentless. This was not grief with a beginning and an end. It was something more corrosive. The constant oscillation between hope and resignation. The inability to mourn fully because mourning required certainty. They imagined scenarios endlessly. An accident that happened too fast to escape. A wrong turn made in darkness. A moment of confusion that spiraled beyond control. Each possibility felt equally plausible and equally unbearable. Joe's siblings spoke less about him over time, not because he mattered less, but because saying his name reopened wounds that never healed. Maribel's family marked her birthday every year, unsure whether to frame it as remembrance or anticipation. The question of whether she was still alive lingered like an echo that never faded. Law enforcement maintained contact, but updates were rare. Phone calls became more spaced out. The tone shifted subtly, less urgency, more caution. Officers never said the case was hopeless, but they stopped offering timelines. They stopped saying when something might change. By the 10th year, the case had settled into an uncomfortable truth. It existed, but it no longer demanded attention. New disappearances took priority. New crimes required resources. Joe and Maribel's files were intact, but they were quiet. Some investigators admitted privately that they didn't expect answers, that if the car had gone into water, it might never be found, that even if it was discovered decades later, the story might never fully explain itself. For the families, this was the hardest realization to accept, that the truth might surface long after it could bring comfort, or worse, that it might never surface at all. In 2012, as the 11th year approached, interest in the case was minimal. There were no active searches planned, no scheduled reviews. It was assumed, quietly and collectively, that the disappearance would remain unsolved. Joe and Maribel became part of a larger category, one of many. A statistic that didn't reflect the daily pain of those left behind. And yet, despite the resignation, no one fully let go. Not completely. Files stayed accessible. Names stayed searchable. Families stayed reachable. Because disappearance cases had a way of returning without warning. Sometimes decades later. Sometimes when no one was looking. By early 2013, most involved had accepted that the road Joe and Maribel took in 2002 might never be retraced. That whatever decision led them away from home had been sealed by time and terrain. The silence had lasted 11 years. It had aged parents, reshaped families, and drained hope slowly rather than all at once. And just when the absence felt permanent, when the case seemed destined to remain unresolved, the quiet was about to break. Not through confession or discovery, but through chance. Through a piece of land that had kept its secret long enough. By the fall of 2013, the disappearance of Joe Wills and Maribel Knox had faded into institutional memory. Their case existed mostly on paper now, filed away under unresolved disappearances, referenced only when someone searched their names or when an anniversary quietly passed. No one was actively looking for them anymore, not because they had been forgotten, but because there was nowhere left to look. That changed on a piece of private land in central Pennsylvania. The property had once been an active quarry decades earlier, then abandoned when operations shut down. Over time, water filled the basin, turning the pit into a deep, stagnant pool. Trees crept in around the edges. Brush overtook old access roads. The land sat untouched, long enough that even locals stopped thinking of it as a quarry at all. In late 2013, the landowner approved a cleanup project. The plan was routine: clear overgrowth, dredge sediment, make the land usable again. Heavy equipment was brought in, and work began without ceremony or expectation. No one involved had any reason to think the job would uncover anything more than rusted debris left behind by the quarry's industrial past. As machinery worked its way through the flooded basin, a dredging arm struck something solid beneath layers of silt. At first, operators assumed it was old equipment or scrap metal. That wasn't unusual. But as sediment was pulled away, The shape beneath the water began to resolve into something unmistakable. Metal panels, a roofline, a windshield frame. Work stopped immediately. Authorities were notified, and within hours, the site was secured. What lay beneath the water was no longer just debris. It was a vehicle. The recovery took time. The car had been submerged for years, possibly more than a decade. Mud and sediment clung to every surface, adding weight and resistance. When it finally emerged from the water, it barely resembled a car at all. Paint was stripped away. Windows were clouded or missing. Corrosion had eaten through metal seams. But one detail survived: the license plate. It was bent, partially obscured by rust, but still legible. When the number was run, it came back immediately. It belonged to Joe Wills. The confirmation sent a shock through everyone involved. Investigators who had worked the case years earlier were contacted. Files that hadn't been opened in a decade were pulled from storage. Families were notified that something had been found, though details were withheld until identification could be confirmed. The vehicle was transported carefully to a secure location. Forensic teams began their work slowly, methodically. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a recovery. Inside the car, there were 2 sets of remains. Both were seated in the front. The positions were consistent with occupants who had never exited the vehicle. There was no evidence of restraints being removed, no indication that either person had attempted to escape after entering the water. Dental records and forensic analysis confirmed what the license plate already suggested. The remains belonged to Joe Wills and Maribel Knox. After 11 years, the question of where they were had finally been answered. But the answer brought a new wave of disbelief rather than closure. There were no obvious signs of violence, no damage consistent with a high-speed impact, no evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle. Toxicology would later be inconclusive due to the condition of the remains, but there was nothing immediately pointing to foul play. Investigators focused on the location itself. That was where the shock truly settled in. The quarry was not hidden. It wasn't miles off-grid or buried deep in wilderness. It sat less than a mile from a roadway that had been considered during the original search. It had access roads. It had been known to locals, and yet it had never been searched. The realization was unsettling, not because of negligence, but because of assumptions. At the time of the disappearance, the quarry was fenced in some areas, overgrown in others. It was private property. No reports suggested the vehicle had turned off the main road. There had been no witnesses, no reason to believe the quarry was relevant. Over the years, it simply fell outside the scope of what anyone thought to examine. Investigators revisited old maps and search grids. The quarry sat just beyond the boundaries that had been prioritized in 2002. Close enough to haunt the review, far enough to have been missed. The weight of that oversight pressed heavily on those involved. 11 years of uncertainty, of unanswered questions, had ended not through new technology or breakthroughs, but through chance. Through a cleanup project that had nothing to do with Joe or Maribel at all. Families were brought to the edge of the site days later. They were not shown the vehicle. They didn't need to be. The confirmation was enough. The absence that had defined their lives for more than a decade was finally anchored to a place. Grief followed quickly, but it was different from what they had imagined all those years. There was no shock left, no sudden collapse, just a heavy, delayed sorrow that settled in slowly, the kind that comes when hope has already been exhausted. For investigators, the case reopened in full, not as a search, but as an examination. How had the car entered the quarry? When? Under what circumstances? Why had there been no signs on the road? Why had the disappearance been so complete? The mystery was no longer abstract. It was physical, now. Measurable. Contained within twisted metal and silt. But clarity did not come immediately. The discovery answered the largest question, where they were, but raised others, just as unsettling. How had two careful, responsible young people driven into a flooded quarry without anyone noticing? Why had there been no evidence left behind? And how had the place that held them gone, unchecked for so long? As forensic teams continued their work, investigators understood that this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different kind of investigation. One that would finally focus not on where Joe Wills and Maribel Knox had gone, but on what had happened in their final moments. And as the quarry water settled back into stillness, it became clear that the silence, which had lasted 11 years, had not erased the truth. It had only delayed it. The road they took had ended here, unnoticed, waiting for someone to disturb the ground and bring everything buried beneath it back into the light. Once the shock of discovery settled, the investigation shifted into a different phase. This was no longer about searching blindly. It was about reconstruction, about taking 11 silent years and carefully threading them back together, minute by minute, decision by decision, until the final moments made sense. The vehicle became the center of everything. When the sedan was lifted from the quarry and cleared of sediment, investigators noted something immediately unusual. There was no catastrophic damage to the front end, no crushed hood, no signs of a high-speed collision. The body panels were corroded, eaten away by years underwater, but the underlying structure told a quieter story. This had not been a violent crash. Beneath layers of hardened silt, technicians uncovered faint tire impressions near where the car had entered the water. Preserved by the quarry's stillness, the marks showed a controlled descent rather than a sudden impact. The angle suggested the vehicle had rolled forward slowly, not launched or lost control at speed. It looked less like panic and more like misjudgment. That detail alone changed the direction of the case. If Joe Wills had not been driving recklessly, then the question became why the car was there at all. Why that road? Why that turn? Inside the vehicle, the interior told its own restrained story. The remains were still positioned forward, consistent with people who never exited their seats. Personal items were minimal, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of someone else being present. But beneath the driver's seat, wedged between rusted metal and compacted debris, an investigator noticed something that didn't belong to the environment. A paper receipt. It was fragile, discolored, barely intact, but readable enough to matter. Forensic technicians handled it carefully, knowing how rare paper evidence was after 11 years submerged. The timestamp was partially faded, but enough numbers remained to establish a window. Late Saturday night. The receipt listed a small convenience store, one that sat on a 2-lane highway less than a mile from the quarry. A place easy to miss, a place no one had thought to revisit in years. For the first time since 2002, the timeline gained a fixed point. Investigators traveled to the store's location, now operating under a different name. Ownership had changed. Staff had come and gone. But the building itself remained. Inside, old storage rooms still held forgotten equipment, including boxes of obsolete media that hadn't been touched in years. Surveillance footage from the early 2000s wasn't digital in the way it was now. It was recorded on aging systems, often stored without labels, rarely reviewed after a few weeks. Most footage from that era was overwritten or discarded. But occasionally, by accident rather than intention, something survived. In this case, it had. After days of sorting through old tapes and drives, technicians found footage from the correct date range. The quality was poor, grainy, inconsistent. But when the timestamp aligned with the receipt, investigators leaned in. There it was. A blue sedan pulling into the lot. 2 occupants inside. The camera didn't capture faces clearly, but the vehicle matched Joe's car. The timing matched the receipt. The moment existed, frozen and waiting. The footage showed the car pausing briefly. No signs of distress, no one following, no hurried movements, just a routine stop late at night. Then, after a short interval, the sedan pulled out of the lot. What mattered most was the direction it turned. Instead of continuing straight along the highway, the car turned onto a narrow gravel road branching off to the side. The road was unmarked, no clear signage, just a break in the tree line that looked, in darkness, like an access path or a turnaround. Investigators followed that road in person. It was uneven, poorly maintained, and led directly toward the quarry basin. In daylight, the danger was obvious. In darkness, especially to someone unfamiliar with the area, it would have looked deceptively safe. Just another stretch of road fading into black. This was the moment everything locked into place. For 11 years, there had been no confirmed final stop, no last known location, just speculation. Now there was evidence, physical, documented, undeniable. Joe and Maribel had been at that store late Saturday night. They had left calmly. They had turned onto that gravel road. And they had never come back. Police concluded this was their final confirmed stop and final known direction of travel. Everything after that happened beyond the view of cameras, witnesses, or records. The realization carried a weight that rippled through everyone involved. For investigators, it was relief mixed with regret. Relief at finally understanding the path. Regret that the answer had been so close all along. For the families, the discovery. Reopened wounds they thought had scarred over. The idea that Joe and Maribel had been less than a mile from the place they would be found, that their last stop had existed in plain sight, was difficult to accept. It reframed the disappearance entirely. This wasn't a mystery that unfolded across states or years of planning. It was a series of small, ordinary choices made late at night. A stop for supplies. A wrong turn. A road that didn't look dangerous until it was too late. Investigators returned to old assumptions and dismantled them one by one. The lack of highway sightings now made sense. The absence of toll records was no longer strange. The silence after Saturday night fit perfectly with the timeline. Even the dog's lost scent near a rural access road years earlier took on new meaning. It hadn't disappeared mysteriously. It had ended where the road did. The case that once felt vast and unknowable had narrowed sharply. The randomness of the discovery gave way to something more unsettling. This wasn't an unsolved puzzle anymore. It was a sequence of events that could be traced, explained, and understood. But understanding did not bring peace. Instead, it raised the final and most painful question. Not where Joe Wills and Maribel Knox had gone, or when their journey ended, but what exactly happened in those final moments after they turned onto that road. Whether they realized their mistake in time, whether there was confusion, fear, or silence. The timeline was no longer lost. It was complete up to the edge of the water. And just beyond that edge, waiting to be examined, was the last part of the story. The truth beneath the surface, where answers existed not in maps or footage, but in physics, forensic detail, and the quiet finality of what happens when a simple wrong turn leaves no room to recover. By the time accident reconstruction experts were brought in, the case had already shifted from mystery to mechanism. The question was no longer where Joe, Wills, and Maribel Knox had gone, but how a routine decision had carried them to a place neither of them understood until it was too late. The access road leading to the quarry was examined closely. In 2002, it had been poorly marked, its warning signs faded or missing altogether. There were no barriers, no lights, no guardrails. At night, the gravel blended seamlessly into the darkness. Investigators determined that a driver unfamiliar with the area could easily mistake the road for a legitimate turnaround or service path, especially after midnight, especially after hours of driving. Experts reconstructed the approach using the preserved tire marks and the vehicle's final position. Everything pointed to a slow, controlled entry. The car did not accelerate. It did not swerve. There was no evidence of last-second braking. The front wheels rolled forward, the ground disappeared beneath them, and the sedan slipped into the water with little resistance. It would have happened quietly. The quarry basin was deep, far deeper than it appeared from the surface. Once the vehicle entered the water, buoyancy would have lifted it briefly before gravity pulled it down. The cabin would have filled quickly. The shock of cold water, the sudden loss of orientation, the darkness. There would have been no time to understand what was happening, let alone escape. Forensic examination of the remains revealed no defensive injuries, no fractures consistent with violence, no signs of restraint or struggle. Toxicology reports showed no presence of alcohol or drugs. Joe had been sober. Maribel had been sober. Whatever happened was not the result of impairment or recklessness. It was a mistake, one that didn't announce itself until it was irreversible. Inside the vehicle, investigators recovered Joe's phone. It was heavily damaged by years underwater, but enough data remained to confirm its final state. The device had shut down within minutes of entering the quarry. There were no outgoing calls, no emergency attempts, no messages left unsent. The silence that followed their disappearance finally made sense. Families had wondered for years why there was no call for help, why there was no trace of panic. The answer was brutally simple. There had been no chance. When the findings were presented to Joe and Maribel's families, the room was quiet. There were no arguments, no disbelief, just a heavy collective understanding settling in. This wasn't the ending anyone hoped for, but it was the truth. Closure did not come with relief. It came with exhaustion. Knowing how they died did not lessen the loss. It only replaced uncertainty with finality. The years spent imagining every possible outcome collapsed into a single reality, one that could not be undone or softened. For investigators, the case was officially closed, not as a homicide, not as a crime, but as a fatal accident caused by environmental conditions and missing safeguards. The quarry was sealed shortly afterward. Barriers were installed. Warning signs were erected where none had stood before. The access road was blocked permanently, changes that came too late to matter for Joe and Maribel. Their names were removed from missing persons lists and entered into a different record entirely, one that marked the end, not the absence. For law enforcement, it was a resolution. For the families, it was an ending they had waited more than a decade to reach, even as they feared it. The blue sedan was eventually destroyed, its purpose fulfilled. The quarry returned to stillness, its surface betraying nothing of what lay beneath it for 11 years. To anyone passing by, it was just another quiet piece of land. But for those who knew the story, it became something else. A reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself, that roads don't always lead where they appear to, and that sometimes the difference between arriving home and vanishing forever is a single turn made in the board dark. Joe Wills and Maribel Knox did not disappear because they were careless, reckless, or pursued by something sinister. They disappeared because the environment failed them, because a place that should have been marked and guarded was left open, because a normal decision unfolded under the worst possible conditions. Their story ended without witnesses, without sound, without anyone knowing where to look. And in that silence, it left behind a truth that felt almost harder to accept than mystery. That sometimes lives are lost not to evil or intent, but to chance. And that the answers people wait years to find can be devastatingly simple once they finally surface.